It's easy enough to talk about war. What's really difficult is to think and talk about no war. Like, no war, come on. But that's what we're going to try to do for the next few minutes. So I want to start by taking you back through some recent history, and we'll get all on the same page. Starting in 1989, when the Berlin Wall came down and the Cold War ended. Now, I'll just tell you, because you're a young audience, but I'll tell you for those who are older, when that Berlin Wall came down, it was absolutely unthinkable for us. We could not believe it. People went to dinner in Germany, and the wall came down during dinner. And the people climbed the wall, started dancing. The soldiers didn't shoot them and kill them. It was astonishing. 2 years later, the Soviet Union fell apart. The impregnable, monolithic Soviet Union came apart. And the power balance in the world was completely changed as we were left with only one superpower. So we had this idea that there must be a peace dividend that would come at the end of the Cold War and all the money that was spent there. And we'll try and figure out if that actually happened. So I'm going to start by asking you a question about war and whether you think that since 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, until the present, just over 20 years, 22 years, I guess, do you think that the number of major wars and genocides went up or down? Now, a major war is defined as more than 1,000 battle deaths in a year. So if you're willing to put your hands up, I'll just ask you, how many of you think major wars and genocides have gone up in the past 20-some years? Okay, quite a bit more than half. How many of you think they've gone down? Oh, good. Okay. Well, the answer is major wars are down 90% since what? Down 90%? Right. 90% in the past 20 years. So you may be thinking what I thought. Well, we humans are warlike species, and so we must have shifted from external wars to internal wars, and probably those have gone up. I won't ask you to put your hands up because I found with audiences after you've been wrong by 90%, people don't want to put their hands up again. And I'll just give you the answer. Wars in general, smaller wars included, are down 40%. And there are other amazing statistics. Since that time, more than 100 wars have just quietly ended. And 60 dictators were toppled, more than 60 now, have been toppled nonviolently. Romania was the example of a small amount of violence at the end until recently. And with the Arab Spring, we have seen some violence in Egypt and Libya, not an outright war, and probably not as much violence as we expected. And Syria, of course, has plunged into a terrible and horrifying war. But continuing this trend downward of the number of battle deaths and the number of wars in the world. Now, I've been preoccupied by war for about 30 years. When I began my medical practice as a family doctor and joined the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, it was just a little handful of people, about 100 people, and very quickly grew to 1985 when there were 250,000 of us. And that's when we won the Nobel Peace Prize for bringing together Soviet and American doctors to say to all politicians all together, in the event of a nuclear war, there is nothing that we can do that will be meaningful. We must prevent this. At that time, there were 70,000 nuclear bombs in the world. There's only 20,000 now, but a tiny fraction of those exploded, say, between India and Pakistan, could cause untold catastrophe on the planet, including producing nuclear winter and wiping out life on Earth. So we can still wipe out all life on Earth in an afternoon. We're not finished. What I found in working on nuclear weapons and talking about them and writing about them all the time was that I was immersed in what is surely the darkest side of the human spirit. And I needed to balance that by looking at nonviolent success stories and other ways that we could be resolving our conflicts. So starting with Gandhi, of course, and his ability to galvanize people to act nonviolently and actually push the British Empire right out of India. That was an extraordinary example. And then continuing from that, of course, we have the civil rights movement in the United States, Nelson Mandela, and so on. But the ones that intrigue me are the stories of small groups of people, women in villages, peasant farmers, who took nonviolent actions of resistance and brought about tremendous social change. And I started collecting those stories. And I ended up not just with dozens of them, but with hundreds of them. And as I looked at them, I thought, this is happening all over the world. There is a kind of global social revolution going on, that we are moving away from war. But I didn't want to say that until I had some credible research. And that's when the statistics arrived on my email, the ones I've mentioned, from the Center for Human Security here in Vancouver, a very credible research institute. And all of those stats are backed up by other research institutes in Sweden and other places. So this is not just a one-shot research paper. And that's amazing, because I had to say, why? Why is this happening, and why now? The researchers drew three conclusions as to why this is happening. They said, first of all, it's the increasing effectiveness of the United Nations in their nation-building initiatives. 67% of those initiatives have been successful. Second thing is the growing influence of international law, and in particular, the founding in 2002 of the International Criminal Court. This is the first time in human history that we have been able to hold the leaders personally accountable if they have incited genocide, if they have committed war crimes or crimes against humanity. They can no longer just catch a plane to some friendly little country somewhere that will take them. This is a massive change. And the third factor they talk about is the increasing power of civil society. That's us. Civil society is the conscience that's brought to bear on government and big business to hold them accountable to the public good. And it must be strong. It must be the third pillar of a strong society. And I've added two other factors that I think are important. One is the rising role being played by women, both in governance and in the economic sector. And I'll give you the statistic there. In countries where women have no rights, they don't have the right to determine how many children they'll have, or whether they can run for office, or whether they can vote, or whether they can be employed outside the home. In those countries, there is a 30 times increased likelihood that they will have a civil war. 30 times as much. And the other factor is the tremendous increase in the engagement of youth. We saw that in the Arab Spring. I'm seeing it in the anti-nuclear movement, in the nuclear abolition movement, where now the vast majority of activists are under 25. It's just brilliant to see that. So people say to me, well, what should I do? How can I help? And you know, I can't answer that question, and you'll see why when I give you three examples. I can't answer it because you need to use your own creativity. I mean, there's even a song that says, a song is a good place to begin. So I can tell you, write letters and so on, but I won't tell you that. I want you instead to go inside and find what it is that you will want to do. So I'll start by telling you three examples. In the Philippines in 1986, Ferdinand Marcos had been the brutal dictator there for over 20 years. But there was an underground movement in the Catholic churches, in their basements, where people were learning nonviolent strategies, the Gandhian strategies, and the strategies of Gene Sharp, an American author. So when the time was right, they were prepared. And the time came when a group of small handful of military officers disobeyed Marcos' orders and refused to march. And they then barricaded themselves in a building, and Marcos sent in the army with tanks to take them out. Cardinal Jaime Sin, who was the head of the Roman Catholic Church, went on Catholic radio and said, hit the streets. Stay in the streets and do not allow the tanks to move into the downtown. The Filipino people went out. It's estimated there were up to 3 million people in the streets, and they stayed there for 4 days and 4 nights, 3 nights and 4 days, and it was on the 4th day that Marcos fled. And those amazing stories that I've heard from the Filipino people are so delightful. I said, weren't you terrified? They said, no, it was like a big party. It was a festival. We were singing, having a picnic, and we said, gee, maybe we'll die here. Well, it's in a good cause. Something happens in those moments of people power. The second example I'll give you, Mayor of Bogota, Colombia, Antonis Marcos. He was a 52-year-old mathematics professor when he decided to do something meaningful with his life, and he ran for the mayor of Bogota, 1995. At that time, Bogota was regarded as probably the most dangerous city on the planet. High homicide rate, traffic in constant gridlock, all the traffic police corrupt. Women couldn't go into the downtown in the evening because they would be attacked and beaten up by children who would rob them. So one of the first things that Mayor Marcos did when he took office was he fired the corrupt traffic police, and he replaced them with pantomime artists. So get this. Right? And the people did exactly what you've done. They laughed, they slowed down, and traffic deaths dropped dramatically. There was a drought, so the mayor went on television and took a shower, turned on the water, got wet, turned off the water, soaped down, turned on the water, rinsed off, turned off the water, and water consumption dropped by 40%. This is why I can't tell you what to do, right? I never would have thought of these things. The final one was to help the women who couldn't go into the downtown. He declared there would be 3 nights that would be women only in the downtown. The men were to stay at home. And the women could come into town, and there would be jazz clubs and coffee houses open and singing and dancing. 700,000 women went into the downtown and reclaimed their city for themselves. Amazing stories. And my final story is my favorite. This is one that I was so privileged to be a part of. The Soviet Union used to test their nuclear weapons on a test range near Semipalatinsk, a place called Karaul. And in 1990, while they were still part of the Soviet Union, the local tribesmen decided that it was time to end this because of the health consequences, the stillbirths and miscarriages and the deformed children and the early cancers. So they contacted the Shoshone Indians in Nevada who suffered the same problems and said, come to the desert, we're getting together and we are going to stop these nuclear tests. 600 people came, 300 locals, 150 doctors and 150 other people from the outside, and it was like a protest I've never seen before. We drove from Semipalatinsk in buses, and as we went over the desert for 3 hours, we saw nothing, no people, a little bit of green sprouting vegetation, and that was it. And then came over a hilltop, and here were these hundreds of people. They had a big sound truck, they had microphones with a translator who went from Kazakh to Russian and another one Russian to English. But they might as well have not bothered because there was so much shouting on the platform, the translators had to keep taking off their earphones. People were leaping up from the audience and grabbing the microphone and yelling, and the translators couldn't keep up, so we stopped listening. The impact of that protest was that Mikhail Gorbachev put in an immediate moratorium on Soviet nuclear testing, and they've never tested again. But the most wonderful part was after that, in the yurts. We were invited to have a feast in these little yurts. 30 yurts, 20 people to a yurt, all of us with different languages. This is the beginning of the protest. This was in Semipalatinsk. And this is the protest in the desert. So we were invited into these yurts, sat in a circle, and had a feast of dried fruits and fresh vegetables, horse meat and goat meat, and toasted with vodka. And about midnight, the host said, you know, this is the host in the picture, I was raised to believe that there is an enemy hiding out there waiting to attack our country, and that's why we had to allow the Soviets to test their nuclear weapons here. But now you're in my yurt, and I guess you are not my enemy. Wolf, you're not my enemy. Kazuo, you're not my enemy. Mary-Wynne, you're not my enemy. You are my family. So who then is my enemy? He said, the whole world is my family. And now you're going to sing for me. We said, what? How can we do that? We all have different languages. He said, you will sing, we shall overcome. And each person in his own language began to sing, we shall overcome. And as we did, I kept thinking of that US spy satellite that was circling overhead, looking down on the Soviet test range, seeing this cluster of white yurts lit up against the sky. And I wish it had a sound receiver so that it could hear us. We shall overcome. We shall overcome. Because, we shall overcome. We, stubborn civil society, we shall overcome. We shall break down the barriers that separate us and mean that we are not part of one human family. And we shall overcome a history of war that is 5,000 years old, because we know that we must break those barriers, that we must build a world that's based on justice, on compassion, on equality, and on peace. And it's not unthinkable, it's already happening. Thank you.